This is Smart Women, Smart Power, a podcast that features conversations with some of the world's most powerful women.
I am so excited to launch and share with all of you a new report that we have just produced, Countering Russia and China, the Hidden Advantages of Women, Peace, and Security. Today, I am in absolutely excellent company to help us dig through the findings and what the implications are for the joint force with my colleague, Dr. Kyleanne Hunter, who is doing incredible, similar, amazing work at the RAND Corporation. And to help moderate and highlight the importance of this work and what it means for the Department of Defense, we're joined by Monica Herrera, who is the Acting Director for International Humanitarian Policy and the Senior Gender Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, my alma mater. So, Monica, if we could turn it over to you, you're going to be facilitating this conversation, but I would love if we could start with your sense of what is women, peace, and security? What has all this meant? Where has DoD been implementing it? Just for your overall thoughts as a scene setter.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. McInnis, Dr. Hunter. It is such an honor to be at this roundtable with you all, and thank you to CSIS for hosting us today, and also for the incredible report that you are launching through this event. So I just want to say thank you for that. And yeah, happy to provide some kind of overarching context. I think probably people who listen to your podcast who might be tuned in are somewhat familiar with kind of the international women, peace, and security framework rooted in UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that was passed back in October 2000, really looking at advancing women's meaningful participation across peace and security sectors to create more sustainable and lasting peace. So for the Department of Defense and really for the interagency, the US government implementing women, peace, and security today, it is also rooted in our WPS Act of 2017. So this is our national legislation passed under the previous Trump administration under broad bipartisan support. We have a bipartisan WPS congressional caucus that also supports this work. So our work really is rooted in the law and in our national strategy, or our strategy and national action plan on women, peace, and security.
And fun fact, Representative Mike Waltz was also the co-chair at one point of the Women, Peace, and Security Caucus.
That's right. That's right. So DoD, we have a lot of lessons learned since the passage of the act, and as we've started to implement and kind of right-size what are DoD's roles when it comes to implementing women, peace, and security. What does that look like within the Department of Defense? We kind of have three general focus areas for our implementation. The first, so they're institutionalization, operationalization, and cooperation, our little kind of taglines there.
Sure.
Institutionalization, some of it looking, I think, broadly at what most people might think about when they think of WPS within the defense sector, which is advancing women's participation across the joint force, across the total force.
Yep.
And also, building our own capacity to understand our roles within women, peace, and security, to organize, train, and equip ourselves to better implement, and to hopefully better utilize some of the tools and the toolkit that you've identified through some of this research. So that's the institutionalization. Operationalization is really rooted in gender analysis. That's also part of the WPS Act, leveraging gender data to help us better understand the operational environment. So we train personnel how to conduct gender analysis as part of broader human terrain analysis so that we can better understand the operational environment, so that we can better understand that men, women, boys, and girls may have different security needs. They may be targeted differently by adversaries. They may experience conflict and crisis in different ways, and how do we really take that into account in our military planning processes?
Well, because militaries tend to operate where people are. So it's a really good idea to understand the people and the complexities and the differences and the similarities amongst them. So.
Absolutely. And then, of course, last is cooperation, really looking at how do we, as we're building our own capacity, work alongside our allies and partners around the world who are also doing this work. Over 100 nations have national action plans on women, peace, and security. Many defense sectors are very interested. We've received a lot of demand signal from across the globe with our defense partners on better understanding how can we leverage WPS, the tools that it provides, to advance military capability. So that's kind of a broad, in a nutshell, as concisely as I can, some overview of DoD's approach. And so I kind of broadly touched on gender analysis as it relates to the operational environment, that level. But Dr. McInnis, your work in this research really looks at gender analysis from a more strategic level and looking at tying it more clearly to some of our national security objectives.
Right. I mean, so that gets to, how did it's for many people, I think slamming women, peace, and security against the problem of strategic competition is not a natural thing to do, right? We tend to, as military and defense institutions, conceptualize the problems in terms of the kinds of widgets and capabilities and the posture and the .mul-PF that we can, for our listeners, .mul-PF is the sort of phrase for describing the different kinds of things that the department does. We thinking about women, peace, and security is just not this natural thing to do. But then when you look at what our adversaries are doing, and this is where we sort of got the idea, hang on a second, there's something to explore here. Russia and China are absolutely using gender. And gender doesn't mean women, right? Gender is a core way to express who we are and think of who we are and how we relate to each other, both at individual and structural levels, right? So when you think about gender, it's not just the women stuff, it's actually who we are as societies, and that's why it's putting a gender analysis into the understanding the operating environment is critically important. They're running these gendered playbooks against us, and they're using these gendered playbooks in critical ways in their own societies to consolidate power. She is doubling down on conservative, regressive gender norms, right? Women are, it's not okay to be a feminized boy. It is, women need to get back into the kitchen, back home, have babies, that sort of stuff to promulgate their notion of what a good society is. Same with Russia, right? Putin's asking women to produce, I think, like 8 babies or something for the country now, and has been very aggressive and upfront about, men need to be hyper masculine and part of the military, and women need to be back home, despite the fact that for decades they had these policies of gender equity. What's actually happening in practice is something different. If they're running these gendered playbooks in their societies and they're using them as ways to consolidate power internationally, why aren't we taking a look at this much more seriously as a defense enterprise? If deterrence and integrated deterrence is all about a psychological calculus. How do we affect the psychologies of our adversaries? And they're using this stuff so deliberately and intentionally. It behooves us as national security professionals to get over our squeamishness about gender analysis and take it seriously. So that's where this started from. And then as we got into the Women, Peace, and Security toolkit, I'm like, holy crap. China and Russia have ceded over half of the human terrain to us, right? This is enormous strategic advantage that we can be utilizing if we just take a more intentional approach to it. And that can manifest in all sorts of ways. Finding new networks with which to cooperate on the ground as China's doing elite capture strategies across Oceania, for example. There's a way to expand the competitive space. So we can employ these tools more strategically and more intentionally and build joint force advantage and American advantage. And as we know, the joint force needs every advantage we can get right now. We are in this place where we're overstretched. Our adversaries are learning from each other. They're collaborating. We need every tool in the toolkit. Let's not disregard this one.
I think to add on a little bit as to why this is so essential in the strategic environment, right? I think we've learned from the past 20, 25 years, we've really conceptualized in a defense capability, women, peace, and security at the very tactical level, right? You see the women talking to women in Afghanistan. You see the humanitarian assistance making sure we're taking care of mothers and children, and that is absolutely essential. Let's not negate. We've learned those lessons really, really well. But if we think about the strategic operating space, and we really think about what integrated deterrence means, there's a lot of talk around weapon systems that are there, right? Like, what's our nuclear arsenal like? Like, how are we going to
send
do
a carrier to a place, and that's going to be deterrence, right?
Yeah, but or also, like, how are we operating under contested logistics or long-range fires? But if we see what the strategic environment actually is, it's a hybrid warfare information environment. This is we think about what our adversaries are doing. Our adversaries are not defeating us with bigger guns, right? Our adversaries are not defeating us with 5th or 12th or 29th, whatever generation we are, fighter right now, right? Or with unmanned aircraft. It's who controls the narrative about what defense and security actually means. And to continue off on Kathleen's point that, like, our adversaries have become incredibly adept at creating this masculine-feminine dichotomy that is rooted in divisiveness, that is rooted in otherizing, that is rooted in really division. If we look at the language that is coming out of both China and Russia around what it means to be a man or a woman, it creates this narrative that really bifurcates societies, right? It pits societies against each other. And we can see some of that influence operation, occurring here, where there are discussions around, like, what women shouldn't be doing, even when it comes to our own defense. So bringing this toolkit to bear is also essential for countering the disinformation campaigns that are being very, very acutely targeted at what it means to be a robust democratic society. And if we think about what integrated deterrence and really the cooperative aspect of integrated deterrence means right now, it is bulwarking democratic societies against authoritarian misgendering that we're seeing happen. It's bulwarking our societies against the ability to create this narrative that is really designed to bifurcate us rather than to bring us together around shared values and norms of the importance of each and every person. So just from a strategic messaging level, the WPS toolkit is so essential for countering that disinformation, that piece of, that piece that can actually get at strengthening societies and making us more robust against the information coming out of China and Russia. Because it's not just impacting their own societies, but we're seeing it very clearly in how they're creating gender norms from within, but these are proliferating into and really trying to undermine the social fabric that makes democracy strong, which is predicated on the value of everyone's contribution and everyone's voice by saying that certain ways of acting are better than others.
Well, and also when we think about advantage and we think about the historical track record, what are the groups that have actually taken down authoritarian or created cracks in the edifice to take down authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, the women's groups.
It's women's groups, right? There's power that women have in expressing their voice and standing up as bulwarks against authoritarianism.
Well, and to the point of women's groups becoming important together, it's also where you see coalition building that destroys sort of authoritarian talks more than anywhere else, right?
Yes.
There's the strategic environment right now thrives on tribalism, right? It really is we look at Xi and we look at Putin and we even look at Kim, right? Like all of these people are thriving off of tribalism in one way or another. Yeah. If we look historically across the world as to how tribalism has been broken down, it is really because of the shared norms and values that women bring to bear to the strategic environment, right? They're able to cut across several of the real deep concerns that exist, but also the fact that they raise the most important security issues that we have of our time, right? Like while there's this talks about next generation fighters and nuclear weapons and everything else, the issues that are leading individuals and societies to be most insecure are things like access to safe food and water, access to reliable healthcare, access to education, economic empowerment for the next generation that we have here. And these are where women are operating. These are the spaces that women have always been operating in because it is the issues that they have been, or us, whoever you want to put it, right, are most responsible for in society. And I think the other piece, and like what's so important about this and so important about countering Russia and China with it, is that women are able to elevate these issues to the key security concerns out there, right? There is tons of empirical data that these are actually the issues that drive war, not who has more nuclear weapons that are there, right? That like conflict is driven by these issues that are women's issues. And in the strategic environment, elevating these as the most important security issues of our time is how we're going to create actually a robust, integrated deterrence against authoritarian messaging.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the ways that we've been approaching in DoD, leveraging women, peace, and security in many ways to reduce those root causes, those drivers of instability that create and set conditions for conflict. And some of that you mentioned, both of you, women, civil society groups, other women's groups, that not necessarily are we suggesting that women are inherently more peaceful, but as you mentioned, Dr. Hunter, in part because there are different gender norms, gender roles within society, that means that men and women have different perspectives about security, about the needs of communities. And as you mentioned, part of WPS is ensuring that those perspectives are being brought to the table so we can have a more holistic understanding of the security environment.
Well, and also improve operational effectiveness in the process.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, because that's ultimately what we're talking about, right? It's making the joint force more effective. And why would we take this off the table? I mean, when we need every advantage we can get right now. Going back to one of your points about, formal and informal networks, I just wanted to foot stomp on that. Everywhere around the world, there's informal networks of women that, cooperate on, from maternal health to schools, schooling issues. I mean, all sorts of things are happening under the radar. And as a government, I would say not just the Department of Defense, but as governments, we find it very hard to get outside of the government bubble, right? And we love to engage with formal power structures because that's who we are. And so, and we've seen different fits and starts at trying to get at what's happening below the sort of transformational diplomacy over the decades. But truly, it behooves us to understand these networks much more carefully, especially because, as Dr. Hunter just pointed out, our adversaries are running this hybrid warfare, political warfare playbook against us. The game is no longer in capitals in the same way that it was. The game is happening on the ground. The game is happening through co-option in all of these places that we just reflexively don't know how to pay attention to yet. And we're running out of time. So.
Well, and to the operational effectiveness point, though, I want to just go back and foot stomp that for a minute as to why this becomes so important, right? We know that the joint force around the world right now, like America's joint force around the world, operates in the crisis zone, right? And whether that means responding to humanitarian crisis, responding to natural disaster, or even engaging in joint exercises in super tense environments, right? Like going out in the South China Sea and engaging in, show of trust exercises, which I think they are more than show of force, with our allies and partners in the region to show that they're there. This toolkit also provides essential things to ensure that we prevent the crisis to conflict pipeline. If we're looking at something like security cooperation or really disaster relief or humanitarian response that's there, we know that bringing these principles to bear and ensure that we are engaging in our allies and partners in a way that prevents the holes that we know lead to actual conflict, right? We know what these things are. We know that when societies and communities start to have inequity in health access, when there is inequity in access to safe food and water, we know that when there is a lack of trust in these systems to maintain the basic rights for individuals and basic like subsistence needs, that's where conflict actually comes up, right? So there is also this very operational need that if we take these frameworks in the way that we are operating in that crisis zone, we are also really shoring up that deterrence in depth, really. When we think about, we hear the term integrated deterrence quite a bit, and we think about, it's redundancy in weapon systems, right? Like that we have there. No, but I think this allows us the ability to pivot the idea of integrated deterrence to create robust structural bulwarks against conflict coming up.
Deterrence through resilience.
Resilience,
Right,
yeah. It's a resilience in depth that can be developed.
Right, and this is such an important point, because there's some of us who, there's those who have the view that, well, the military is about fighting and winning the nation's wars, right? And so it becomes a limiting construct. But those of us who have been involved in or around the wars of the past 20 years, I mean, really? Nobody wants to go to war, right? Like, we have to be prepared to do so. So I say all of this because not only is that the prevention and resilience toolkit critically important for how we act as a country in the world and achieve our strategic ends, but also, God forbid, the balloon goes up. We want to make sure that we have all kinds of pathways to counter our adversary. You think about the logistics, the geographic problems that the Pacific Ocean presents, the joint force. My God, if we're not building much more dense networks of interlocutors across Oceania, we're going to have some even bigger problems.
Well, and this is our key ability to build those robust partnership networks.
Right.
So if during crisis we're able to build trust with our allies and partners, whether it is across Oceania where we have the Pacific Ocean contested logistics problem, whether it is in Europe where we have a aggressive adversary who has made it very well known that he wants to take back the Soviet Union and take back sovereign states' ability to be sovereign. We build that resilience through mutual strategic trust. And mutual strategic trust comes through building community resilience, not through having a bunch of strongmen hanging out with guns, but
although there is a time and place for that.
But when we think about even the idea of strongmen with guns, when we think about how, and we can look at Ukraine as a very clear example of this right now. When we think about where armed defense, when it gets to that point, when it actually works to build more robust societies is when you have societal buy-in to the actual conflict. And if we continue to ignore half the population, when we think about strategically building these allies and partnerships, we don't have democratic societal buy-in. We don't actually have that. We continue to create these bifurcated classes systems of protector-protected type idea, which leads to crumbling societies rather than, so there is that participation. When we think about that institutionalization piece that the DoD is doing, having women squarely involved, shoulder to shoulder with our brothers in arms is an essential piece of democracy, because we have full societal buy-in to actually the defense, and we encourage full societal buy-in because that's how we make a more robust society.
100%. And also, again, when you think about wartime scenarios, so this research took us to Indo-PACOM, it took us to EUCOM. We sort of looked at those two theaters specifically. When we went to EUCOM, and I'm a NATO nerd by trade, I've been thinking about the European security problem in a lot of depth for a number of years, and insufficient defense spending and what that's led to in terms of European force structure, right? We've got a big quantitative disadvantage in the European theater in so many ways. And so as we were doing these discussions, it was brought up, why couldn't we think of women, peace, and security as a strategic offset, like Cold War style strategic offset of Russian quantitative advantage, right? If we actually build whole of society, if we actually think about things like women's body armor and think about what it means to have women as part of a whole of society resistance strategy, resilience strategy, then if you minimize fog and friction on the day, God forbid that something happens. Doing that planning ahead of time gives you much more advantage in crisis.
It also really, when you put women sort of front and center in the operational capacity, right? When you have women who are on the front lines, whatever that means in these warfares, right? Which could be holding a gun and fixing bayonets and charging. It can be sitting in the cyber information space. It could be operating this or whatever. But as operators, however we're defining this in this changing world of warfare, it also opens up the types of seats at the table women get in post-crisis environments. We know from vast amounts of of research out there that having women as part of post-conflict negotiations makes those negotiations so much more robust.
Yes.
For too long, I think what we've seen is that women, when they are included in these discussions, get relegated into very sort of boxed roles, right? Like you can come here as a mothers group. We need mothers groups at the table. They need to stay here at the table, right? You can come here as a interfaith dialogue group, right? We need them at the table that way too. But we also need women at the table as the prime security actors. Because for way too long, when we look at these post-conflict negotiations that we've seen, the individual bodies that are representing the security interests continue to be elite men who have held power. And I think to break some of how they are thinking about what security means, to break some of how we get back into a lot of these cycles of increased militarism and increased sort of brink of strategic warfare, we need to bring hard security actors with different perspectives as the prime sitting at the table.
Well, I think that's, you bring up such an interesting point regarding women in positions of decision-making power. Dr. McInnis, you sort of talked about women often hold informal roles of authority, but Dr. Hunter, you're sort of talking about we need also women in these formal positions of authority. And the defense and security sector is one of those areas where if you get more women into these institutions, they're likely to be educated and better understanding the institutions, rising to positions of more formal power, and then opening the door, adding a seat at the table to ensure that we have people within defense and security institutions, people representing civil society, and just more kind of diverse perspectives, providing a holistic kind of look at the entire security environment.
Well, and that leads to another project that Smart Women, Smart Power has undertaken over the past couple of years. We've done we use the podcast to actually understand the difference it's made having women in these decision-making spaces. What's the real, no kidding, brass tack, dollars to donuts? What's the value add? Not hypothetical. Let's give us the real stories. And the advantages are manifold to having women in these spaces. Not only does it improve organizations' ability to understand the strategic environment in which they're operating, just by virtue of these different perspectives that are brought to the table, they also tend to be conduits for new information that can be brought to bear. So, for example, Elizabeth Shackelford, one of our first guests, was talking to us about the situation in Darfur, and one of the experiences she had was outside of a refugee camp where women had to go in and out of the camp every day to get food and water, and there were rape huts on the way out. So the women who were experiencing these horrible brutalities didn't feel comfortable talking to any man in the U.S. government. They reached out to her. So in terms of gathering intelligence about the environment, it makes a lot of sense to have women in all of these different decision-making spaces. It's not just because it's nice to have and we feel great having women there. No, there are strategic advantages that we give ourselves by doing so. Let's pay attention to that.
We can also fundamentally transform the way these organizations interact nationally and internationally by creating space for diverse, right? And it's not just having female bodies sitting at a table, right? Because I think that's often right, or having the
add women.
Women just sure it gets better.
Or
the women dust.
We want things to look like a United Colors of Benetton ad. I mean, those Gen Xers in the room here too, right? That have it, right? But it's actually allowing space for unique perspectives to come in and challenge the status quo and bring new ways of thinking, because that's how we become better, right? And I think one of the tensions that has existed in the security space, the DoD and really the military, that's where my background comes from, the military world, is that there's this often tension between the need for uniformity to build trust, right? You need to be able to build trust that the person, and I know you come from this world too, right? The person sitting next to you, standing next to you, is going to operate, act, and react in a very predictable way when chaos ensues, right? Like that's something that's absolutely essential. And so grappling with and why this becomes such a strategic advantage is that the way I've seen the DoD starting to implement women, peace, and security is addressing this head on. When you think about the institutionalization, it's not shying away from the fact that there's a tension, right? There is a real palatable tension, right? This tension between the need for uniformity to create predictability and chaos, which is essential when we're looking at warfighting, with the need to ensure that individuals have the ability to show up as their true, authentic selves, because we all bring incredibly different perspectives on what is secure and what is insecure to the table. And that's how we fill in the gaps, right? That is how we fill in the gaps. And so this toolkit allows that challenge to be faced head on.
That's exactly right. I mean, because warfare, today and in the future, it's not, these conventional battles, or we're going to have these static lines, and it's a matter of brute force to plug, to cut through them. We are in a political warfare, hybrid warfare environment. So having people having these different perspectives, having everybody being able to bring their best selves to the table, it is essential. Right? It's essential to be able to do the job of the joint force.
And I think back to even when the Marines were doing the whole studies on the removal of women in ground combat and what that was going to look like, and how they created all these. They had like women-only teams, they had men-only teams, they brought mixed gender teams together. And one of the findings that got really buried from this, but I think is really essential in pulling out, is that the mixed gender teams, they may not have been like the fastest to do anything, but they actually solved problems the best, right? And they actually create, like when they sent them through like very specific tactical exercises. Yeah, maybe they didn't like jump over walls the fastest that were there, but they in these simulated combat environments, they had fewer civilian casualties. They were actually able to bring information back to command centers that led to better decision making that was done in the long term, right? And a big part of that is that if we think about the fog of war, and we think about what hybrid warfare is trying to do, it breeds on chaos, and it really requires unilateral, singular thinking to survive and thrive. When you bring more thinking into it, you're basically plugging more holes, right? You are setting up more and more, defense in depth, as we like to say as a military term, against this ability to happen, right? And so it shows this, I think, very clearly, why in an environment where our adversaries breed off of division, they breed off of unilateral and singular thinking, they breed off of trying to sort of tamp down dissenting opinions and make them seem wrong or unacceptable, or that they don't have a place in security, ensuring that they stay elevated is our best defense.
Well, and also just to the point that you made, which I think is a really important one about civilian casualties and the minimization, right? Now we've got the Afghan War Commission who's like doing the analysis on what happened, why, how. But I remember sitting in Kabul with Secretary Gates as part of the delegation doing an engagement with Karzai, and he was furious about civilian casualties, right? He was unable to hold the government together because of some of the casualties that the U.S. military caused, and we're like, oh, that's war. Well, dissolution. No, it was actually a strategic vulnerability that, over time, as I think back, what happened, like, it was a thread through how we failed. Right? It was a friction point, and so the civilian harm mitigation. It's not like this. Again, it's not this nice to have thing that's counter to Clausewitzian notions of warfare. It's actually how we do our jobs effectively in this strategic environment.
And there's absolutely a huge push within the Department of Defense to strengthen our civilian harm mitigation response. We have an action plan. We have a workforce coming on board to support these efforts.
Hugely important.
But no better place to integrate gender analysis, right? To better, if we're looking at civilian environment, the effects of military operations on the civilian environment, a gender analysis, a gender lens certainly better informs the ways in which different elements of the population might be affected, and that is certainly something that we, train on gender analysis. So, I think so many overlapping potential opportunities to integrate some of this work. And I know I kind of want to go a little bit back to the sort of cooperation, the security cooperation we sort of talked about. Building societal resilience. Some of the comments you mentioned earlier, Dr. Hunter, sort of reminded me about, I spent about over 8 years working in the Indo-Pacific theater, including my time on active duty, and some of the work that our WPS workforce has been doing out there is really, we're getting that demand signal from allies and partners in the region that, hey, we recognize that we want to get after transnational threats. We want to get after the root causes of instability, and the Indo-Pacific Command Team had run a counter-trafficking in persons workshop, but gender responsive. And you kind of mentioned like the importance of bringing all these different voices and perspectives to the table. And so the law enforcement was there, maritime law enforcement was there, but we had women civil society groups there. And what we realized was all of these people were working on focusing on the same topic, but some of them had never met each other or didn't know that they were even working. And so we were able to, they were able to drive for themselves what might cooperation look like, how we may be able to strengthen this in a way that builds cohesion, that builds resilience to coercion, that kind of gets after all of these kind of broader connections to what we're trying to do, integrated deterrence, countering coercion in the region and globally.
And what you mentioned that's so important there is that when we think about security, wars aren't fought on battlefields anymore. Right. Wars are, and I think a lesson that we need to pull, one of the coin axioms that always came is like winning hearts and minds, right? And we think of that as like village stability. But what you just referenced is actually building resilient hearts and minds through security cooperation, right?
Yes.
Through, like, if we look at trafficking in persons as one of the ways, right? Like, how do you counter traffic in persons? You understand the human terrain, and you figure out what is motivating, the nefarious actors, right, in this case, and you bring together the appropriate coalition to actually change behavior, right? And I think that's a piece when we think about warfare today. It's not going to be fun, right? It's not going to be like, we haven't been for a long time, yet we still plan so many of these things, like there's going to be some very well-defined battlefield, and like soldiers will go duke it out, and the civilians will hang out over here, right? But no, this shows that we are in a intentionally hybrid environment, and our adversaries will try to exploit that by continuing to say, well, that's law enforcement's job, that's civil society's job, that's the defense's job, right? They want that. And so bringing everything together is such an important aspect.
I think building those networks of connection across, right? So as you said, when the balloon goes up, now you have a stronger society, a more connected society that's able to...
And more touch points, right? More of our own touch points with these local communities that we, you can't, what you said in the global war, you can't surge trust. You can't just build like, hey, we're the U.S., we're here to help. No, in the crisis, we have to actually do this stuff intentionally now in order to build options for the future. We got some questions from the audience.
Oh boy.
Right. Yeah. One question is, what recommendations do you have to ensure senior leaders understand the importance of women, peace, and security, and maintain buy-in to ensure women, peace, and security is incorporated into military operational planning?
I'm happy to start off on
person who does this every day inside the Pentagon is a good.
Interestingly, we also, so I, I'm dual-hatted. I'm an Air Force reservist now. I spent time on active duty, but I am an information operations officer. So I am deeply passionate about, messaging and communication, and that is something that we include in our training for personnel who are working on WPS. First and foremost, we shouldn't be doing any WPS that isn't directly connected to our primary mission sets, to our primary strategic objectives. Now, how that implementation looks across different organizations and institutions within the department, that may vary, right? So the importance of framing WPS, being able to clearly identify how is this work that you're doing connecting to your commander's priorities. Yeah. What language are they using? What are the things that day to day you're seeing around your own organization are the priorities? And if our WPS work isn't contributing to that, maybe we need to revector, because then it should speak for itself. Mm-hmm. We should be able to clearly connect it to the priorities of our commanders. That is entirely what we're doing. We're providing tools for our leadership, for our commanders. So I would say that's probably the number one thing, is sort of connect it to the operational priorities, strategic priorities.
And with that, though, becomes, I think, essentially as to how we measure that connection, because too often when WPS commanders will just say, oh, look, well, I have like 20 women over here, so I'm done with WPS. Right, and it gets often so equated with many of these DEI conversations that we have, right? Of like WPS is like, oh well, there's the women, so we did it, right? Or tick, right, exactly.
We have a woman in this position of leadership. We have achieved.
We done, right? We did it, right? But so it's so essential to take both, tie it to it, but then also actually legitimately track and measure, right? We know that everything happens in the big bureaucracy that is our Department of Defense, happens because there's some metric tied to it that people have to act on. And so a big piece of this is it feels weird to say getting creative, but it really is getting creative about how we're measuring success in ways that tie to operational effectiveness. And one of the things that we've done at RAND is build this framework that looks at improvised versus operational implementation of WPS, right? And the big intent is to try to determine, well, how do we capture all these improvised things, right? Because what we find, and like I know you know this from like your time on active duty, and anyone who's found time on active duty, is that like service members are super creative when it comes to actually figuring out how to confront and solve problems, right? Like they are super creative. But so often we don't capture how that actually solved the problem. And so one of the things that I think needs to be done more is to really reach down into these operational level security actors, right? Our captains and majors, our sort of staff sergeants and gunnery sergeants that we have there, and really dig into how are they solving problems, because they are so often they are doing this. And I think we have a generation that is growing up in the military right now that grew up with more of these principles than I think either of our generations ever did, right? This is something that we work, or I was, I'm the old lady at the table here, right? Like that we were confronted with sort of later on, and we had to figure out how to adapt it to. I think we have a generation that has grown up with this a little bit more, who like has some intuitive understanding that even our most senior leaders don't have, even the ones who really, really believe in it. So another piece of this is reaching down and really capturing what are they doing to be able to create meaningful metrics behind this.
I'm so glad you're passionate about this, Dr. Winter, because we are currently running workshops to develop our monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework for our forthcoming department implementation plan on on WPS. So you can be expecting a call for sure from our implementing partners to help us, really kind of narrow that down.
Well, and in terms of making the case, one of the things that we did as part of the methodology for this study was a series of tabletop exercises run by our colleague Ben Jensen, and we essentially tested with war planners. We gave them different menus of options. A gender-informed operations, activities, investments in Indo-Pacific theater. And then globally, but that's another methodological point. But also gender uninformed, so there's traditional. And overwhelmingly, military planners, people with at least 15 years of experience working these issues within the Department of Defense at operational and strategic levels, overwhelmingly chose the gendered-based option because they saw the strategic advantage embedded within them.
Right? And I know that was like a double blind situation.
Right, exactly.
People didn't even know that those were necessarily the options that they were choosing from, right?
Exactly. And so at some point, it just kind of, you look at the tools and the advantage, it just makes plain sense. And, the other piece of this is that women constitute what I think is the last 17.5% of the active duty force now. That's That's a lot of the joint force that we, looking at the strategic environment we are operating in, and what our adversaries are trying to bring to bear. We can't afford to lose almost 20% of our workforce, so we need to take these things seriously. And then the final, and this is sort of my own personal observation of how Russia has been fighting this war and the propaganda that it has been promulgating to recruit folks to fight in Ukraine. For all of the aggressive masculinity that is a part of that, and like what it means to be a man and fighting on the front lines, they suck. Militarily, they have not, they're getting better. There's a lot of discourse about the way that they've been getting better, but like, they've 700,000 casualties, right? Is this the kind of way, a good way a good organizational culture to promulgate when it comes to the military and the force of the future? I would suggest that perhaps the current operational track record suggests otherwise.
And it goes to there's unfortunately a continued narrative that there's something like innately better about a group of men fighting, right? Like, and we saw this, right? We saw this when we were doing the removal of women in ground combat exclusion here in the States. We see this in the rhetoric coming out of Putin. We're seeing this in Xi. We see this with North Korea's military, right? That there's some like mystical, magical thing that makes a bunch of dudes on the front lines fight better. Mm-hmm. But with the reality, and this goes back to how to show it, but the reality shows like that's just fundamentally not true. Like there is actually zero evidence to show that there is some like magical power that they possess, right? But what is true, and I think if you look at Afghanistan, right, which is a big topic of debate right now, but you look at Ukraine, you look at, even going back in history to some of the Papua New Guinea freedom fights, you go and you look at the ability of like Colombia to build resilience in a government against authoritarian regimes and guerrilla warfare, right? You look at all of this, where the evidence bears out that you actually have, when you have conflicts and you have a reduction of civilian casualties, you actually have conflicts last a shorter period of time, you have more robust agreements coming out of it, is when women are there on the front lines too.
Yeah.
Right? When women are actually around on the front lines. And so the empirical evidence, and again, like how you continue to convince senior leaders is the data don't lie. You cannot like it. It can go against a lot of the things that you really want to feel and believe deep in your core, but the data don't lie.
Yeah.
They just don't, right? You have and I think we're seeing this borne out so well, where you have right now in Russia and Ukraine playing out on one side this hyper-masculine, only men are going to fight, and you're seeing casualty rates that nobody predicted, right? I think at the beginning of this conflict,
bananas.
The prediction was that Russia was going to walk all over this, right? And so I think to go back to one of your first points is that when we think about all these quantitative advantages, the calculus is wrong. The quantitative advantages is based on some mystic belief that men are inherently better at fighting, and what we found is that that's not real math.
Well, and we're just at time, so just to close the conversation with a thought, which is, I was in Ukraine about a year and a half ago, and I was told by a lot of the interlocutors that we met with that one of the key reasons that Ukraine has been able to resist is because of the work that was done after 2014 to invest in civil society groups and women's groups specifically. It created a national identity, something to stand up against Russia, a backbone. Mm-hmm. And so taking it forward into this research and hopefully how the Department of Defense continues to perceive these issues, we need to think about women, peace, and security as a strategic advantage, a strategic enabler for DoD activities, operations, and investments. We literally cannot afford not to.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. What a wonderful conversation.
So much, Kathleen, such a pleasure.
And for those of you online at csis.org, take a peek at the website. There's all sorts of materials to take to look at on all of the issues of the day. So have a poke around. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.